Thank you so much. Wonderful. Sweet. Thank you so much.
Behold, it's Natalia. Let's go find some monkeys, shall we?
Would you say sex is like riding a bicycle?
Nothing gets me going like Christmas and wigs. Let's check out this show.
I remember the first creature I beheld. He was a squirrel. His name was Kevin.
I heard you need a DNA sample.
I want to find light and joy in things that bring us together and unite us. And I think science is something that can unite us. Ow. God damn.
There's a world out there, a world that needs to be beheld.
Yes, behold, and welcome back to Survival of the Filthiest. It's another episode. I am your host, Natalia Reagan. I'm a biological anthropologist and comedian, and I created this show because, let's face it, there's a war on science and social progress in this nation. So what better way to resist than to have folks on that are doing groundbreaking science activism and creating some very good trouble, because that's what we need right now to move the country forward rather than 10 steps back. And for the name, sometimes you got to get a little dirty to survive. So Survival of the Filthiest it is. And here's a quick reminder to please like, subscribe, and comment if you'd like. And if you want to support the production of this, highfalutin show, you can join my Patreon. I would very much appreciate it. Okay, I am sick with excitement about today's guest, but just my luck, this gentleman is an epidemiologist, so he can help me. Yes, Neil Vora, MD, you got to say it that way, is the executive director of Preventing Pandemics at the Source Coalition. And before that, he was with the CDC and the chief contact tracer in New York City during the height of COVID-19. He was actually handpicked by Mayor de Blasio himself. But folks, Neil is not just an epidemiologist. Neil is a conservationist too. Let me explain. Way before COVID, Neil worked in Western and Central Africa during the Ebola outbreaks in 2014 and 15. Neil has long described himself as a disease detective, trying to determine the source of deadly outbreaks, so he could head them off at the pass. And while playing the source sleuth, Neil discovered that deforestation had a direct impact on disease transmission between animals and humans, aka zoonotic transmission. So thus began Neil's mission to reduce deforestation in the hopes to prevent future pandemics. Neil also believes that humans need nature to survive. And guess what? Nature is very dirty, so sign me up. And in fact, you need to watch Neil's TED Talk, How to Prevent the Next Pandemic, Stop Deforestation. And as a primatologist who studied a species of spider monkey who was hanging on by the thread of extinction because of deforestation. So I completely agree with this assessment. Deforestation affects so many things from top to bottom. So not only is saving the forest saving the species habitat, it is also contributing to the health and prosperity of our own. So I'm thrilled to welcome the fantastic Neil Vora, MD. Hi, Neil.
Hi, Natalia. So good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am so excited. Not only Neil is a friend, I'm totally name dropping, but also somebody I absolutely look up to because you really address so many things that need to be addressed right now: conservation, forest conservation, and stopping pandemics in their tracks. So I want to know your story. How the heck did you even become a doctor? What really, did you always want to be a doctor?
Well, again, thank you so much for having me here today. It's an honor to be here. And I just am such a big fan of the way you merge science and comedy. And I think it's so important to tell stories the way you do to get people to understand science differently than maybe some of the boring ways that we might have learned it in school. And in terms of my path, of course. In terms of my path to medicine, I have to rewind back to childhood. And growing up, I learned very early on about the importance of public health. My dad was born in India, and when he was a kid, he had smallpox. And thankfully, he survived, which is why I'm here today. But again, growing up, when I would look at his face, I saw the legacy that smallpox left on his life in the form of scars that he has to this day, over 70 years later. And smallpox is this terrible disease. It kills 30% of people that have it. Thankfully, it has been eradicated thanks to the work of public health professionals around the world, particularly in the 60s and 70s. That's a gift that keeps on giving. None of us have to worry about naturally acquired smallpox anymore, thanks to the work of those people back, a few decades ago. And so that planted the seed in my mind that maybe one day I would be doing public health as a doctor. And then when I was around 14 or 15, I watched the movie Outbreak, and Dustin Hoffman and Cuba Gooding Jr. in spacesuits convinced me that one day I would get to wear like a hazmat suit and chase dangerous diseases for the CDC. And I'm so grateful that I had that opportunity.
And there you, oh my goodness, that's crazy that you saw that and you're like, I want to do that. And you did it. And I will mention real quick, the Outbreak movie, the monkey that runs out at the beginning is a capuchin monkey that is found in the Americas. And so I remember being like, wait a minute, that's not accurate. But everything else that happens is pretty darn scary. So you went on to become an epidemiologist. And where did you go to school?
So I did my undergraduate at the University of Southern California, and I was in this program that basically allowed me to study whatever I wanted and still have a guaranteed spot in medical school. And so I studied international relations and biology with a focus on environmental science, and I had a minor in philosophy. And my goal, even back then, was before I started medical school, was to somehow combine my passion for health and public health with my other passion for conservation. I didn't know how I would do that, but I just knew that in my gut, somehow all of these topics were related to each other. And so I ended up going to medical school in San Francisco, had an incredible experience, and then did a residency in internal medicine in New York City at Columbia University. And every step of the way, the training got more and more pleasurable. As you get deeper into a field, it gets more exciting. And doing residency is really intense. You're working long hours, but you're also working alongside people who are so dedicated to saving lives. And, you're in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. with other young doctors and nurses and health professionals. And you're in an ICU maybe, and you're doing everything you can to keep people who are critically ill alive. And that is just a huge honor that I would never trade. But at the same time, after I finished my internal medicine residency, I knew that I wanted to get more into population level work. And so I joined the CDC through this program called the Epidemic Intelligence Service, EIS. And that's a crown jewel program of the CDC. I'm so lucky that I was in it. It was set up back in maybe the 1950s in response to the threat of biological warfare. And and if you've ever seen the movie Contagion, as you can tell, I like movies a lot. But Kate Winslet in that movie is an EIS officer. And so I had the honor of, So I did.
You're our Kate Winslet.
Not as pretty.
Uncanny resemblance. Yeah. No.
Yeah. But then I got to chase outbreaks around the world. And, fast forward almost a decade later, I ended up leaving CDC. And now I work for at the intersection of conservation and health, and do a lot of other stuff.
It's a wild journey. And before we get too far along, we have a mutual, I think, academic, I don't know if we call it a crush or a love affair with the wonderful Jane Goodall. And I know that she was very influential in your life. And I don't know if you have anything that you wanted to say about, did you write Jane when you were a kid, or feel like?
No, I had, so my sister ended up going to boarding school in the UK, the United Kingdom. And so her graduation speaker, this is maybe back in maybe 1995 or something like that. But her graduation speaker was Jane Goodall. And so I was so excited. And I went to that graduation. I was maybe like 11 years old at the time. And I went with my National Geographic, on which she was on the front cover, and she signed it for me. And I have a picture with her. But what's your connection to Jane?
Well, just primatology in general. So I've met her 3 times now, and every time, like, I cry. And I will say this, that the second time I met her, I was taking, the first time she was exhausted. It was at our big international primatology conference, and she was being passed around from primatologist to primatologist. But the second time we were taking a photo, and I was just smiling, looking at the camera, and she stops and goes, I like it best when you look at each other in a photo, because you get an actual connection. Like,
Wow.
even in a photo, she's trying to connect.
Oh,
So, I turned to look at her, and as you can imagine, Neil, like, just it's like ugly crying, So
yeah.
the 2 other times I've met her, I'm just ugly crying in the photos because I'm forced to look into her wise and loving eyes.
Oh, that's
So,
amazing. Yeah, I saw her speak a year or two ago in New York City, in
oh,
Brooklyn, and I don't know, she's like in her late 80s or something like that, and she just captivated the entire auditorium. Like, I just can't believe she has so much energy and so much passion and so good at telling stories, and we were just all so energized by everything she had to say. We were all hanging on.
yeah, well, I was gonna say it sounds very familiar because I feel like you're heading into that territory, my friend, you know?
Well, right
You've got
back
some
at you.
but you got some great stories, and I wanna hear about your time with the CDC and when you spent time in Africa and kind of how you, uh, fell back into conservation as you were playing this disease detective. What does that mean, being a disease detective, first of all?
So when I joined the CDC through that EIS program, the way it works is you choose a program that you're going to be placed at for the duration of that 2-year program, and you basically you put down what your choices are, and then those programs rank their top choices, and you basically get matched to each other. And I wanted to be in a program that focused on zoonotic diseases, and in particular, having done already a lot of work with humans as a medical doctor, I really wanted to get more involved in uh, disease control focused on animals, but particularly diseases that have an impact for people. And so I ended up joining the poxvirus and rabies branch, which
Ooh,
was,
ooh.
yeah, exciting because rabies is one of the most diabolic diseases there is, right? Like,
It's no joke.
no joke, right? Like, if you show symptoms of rabies, you have nearly 100% chance of dying. And every rabies death to this day is a public health failure because we have the vaccines to prevent rabies. Now, shockingly, over 50,000 people a year still die of rabies, right? Like, these are all completely preventable deaths. And so, and most of the deaths are related to rabies transmitted through the bite of a dog, right? And so
Mm,
again, it's the reason I say it's a diabolic disease, though, is that it invokes vampires and rabies. And I love horror, and so I can tell you a
yeah,
little bit about the
yeah.
origin of vampires. But the other thing about rabies is that for you to test an animal to see if it has rabies or not, you basically have to. It has to be dead, and you have to chop its head off, and then it gets sent to a laboratory where they do the testing, right? So it's such a
Yeah,
crazy.
that's not a subtle test approach. No, that's, yeah, you gotta that's a commitment. Oh,
It is a
wow.
commitment, yeah,
Oh, god.
but got to do a lot of work around that. Also, I mean, in terms of full circle, right? I was in the poxvirus branch, and again, my dad had smallpox. That was my introduction to public health, and so I had the great honor of leading the investigation for a newly discovered smallpox-like virus in the country of Georgia. And so we were traveling around in these Soviet-era military vehicles through the hills of
Wow.
Georgia, looking for people who might be infected with this new virus. And again, it's just a privilege to do this type of work.
And what did you find? I mean, was it a big problem? Did you have a bit of an outbreak, or
Yeah, so it was thanks to these astute clinicians who basically saw several cow herders that were presenting with these lesions on their hands. And initially they thought, well, maybe this is anthrax because there's a fair amount of anthrax in the area, and they tested for anthrax in Georgia.
that's so metal.
Yeah, yeah, I know, so metal, right? But it was negative for anthrax, and then they tested for a few other local pathogens that nothing came back positive. But then this astute clinician thought, well, maybe this could be cowpox, right? And
Ah, yes, which is the
yeah,
original, yeah, source of the original vaccine, if you wanna go into that. You probably could tell it better than me.
well, but again, this, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's incredible, right? Back in the late 1700s, Edward Jenner and a few other people basically recognized that these, particularly it was women working with cows and milking the cows, were not getting smallpox. And they basically concluded that it was, well, they were getting cowpox, which is a related infection caused by the cowpox virus, but it's not smallpox virus, but there's this cross protection. If you get infected
Ah,
with the cowpox virus, you have protection against smallpox. And so in any case, fast forward a few centuries, and we're in the country of Georgia, and that astute clinician said, well, maybe this is cowpox. And so they ended up sending samples to the capital of Georgia, and thanks to the relationship between the Georgian public health entities and the US CDC that has an office in the country of Georgia, they got the samples to the US CDC, and we tested it, and we discovered it was a brand new virus. And so we went out there and we did field investigations, and we found that cows were being exposed, and that rodents also had evidence that the virus was circulating in the rodents running around the cow fields. And so it's all kind of one big circle there.
It's all connected. It really is. Like, I think we all need to remember that, we're in close proximity with a lot of, I mean, not always, it depends on where you are, but like with a lot of animals at any given time. There was a woman who actually, when you were talking about rabies, it was actually a sad story. I don't know her name off the top of my head, but she was a school teacher here in California. A friend of mine actually knew her. I don't know, she was repairing a light or it was up on the ceiling of a school, but she got bit by a bat and no symptoms and died of rabies like a month later. So it's even, and I know how much I was going to ask you your favorite animal, because I know how much you do love bats, but bats being an important vector for disease and human interaction, especially because they oftentimes will live in our dwellings. I was curious if, moving into the Ebola question, because I know that you worked in Africa during the time of Ebola outbreaks. How did that sleuthing go when you were playing disease detective?
Yeah, and let's talk a moment about bats before we get to Ebola, right? Because I love bats. They're my second favorite group of animals after snakes. And so as we move forward, I don't want people to get the wrong impression about bats. Bats are our friends. Just respect them from a distance, right? If you drink tequila, you have bats to thank for that, because bats pollinate the agave plant, and that's why the agave plant is proliferating. Or bats are very important for controlling insect populations, and so actually right now across North America, there's the spread of this fungal infection called white nose syndrome. It was perhaps introduced to North America on the bottom of a spelunker's boot, maybe from somewhere in Europe or Asia, right? So this is like that. The movement of pathogens in animals and the devastating consequences it can have. But over 1 million bats across North America have died now from this infection. So it's having tremendous consequences. But this one scientist recently, last year basically, published this paper in Science that showed that in parts of the US where white nose syndrome has taken hold, there's been actually an increase in the use of insecticides. So farmers have been resorting to more use of insecticides because these insect-eating bats are dying off. And then that scientist went one step further and basically linked that increased use of insecticides to infant mortality. These areas where more insecticides are being used have higher infant mortality. Now, I want to be very clear. We can't say for sure that the insecticide use is leading to infant mortality, right? Like, this is more of a correlation than a causation, but the scientists use very robust methods. And it's just a reminder, again, that everything's interconnected.
So connected.
And sometimes the things we do to nature, or the things happening to nature because of our activities, have very surprising impacts on our own health.
Absolutely. Yeah. I feel like the playing God, sometimes where humans have either introduced a species to sort of, take care or eradicate another species, has backfired infinitely, in terms of, like, I think of cane toads brought to Australia to take care of locust problems, but they don't fly, but locusts do. And so now you got a cane toad problem, and cane toads are deadly if you ingest them. So all these dogs are dying. And then now they have like these cane toad festivals where they just kill them. And I'm like, these cane toads didn't ask for this, like they're just doing their own thing, and I love toads.
Oh yeah.
I've licked a few in my past. I know. I just, yeah. But I think the playing of God, or forgetting about the intrinsic value, even like mosquito, trying to eradicate mosquitoes, or, the sterilization of the females and things of that sort that have, things that are in play to sort of limit mosquito populations. There's question of whether or not they feed other species, and taking them out of the ecosystem, will this have some sort of butterfly effect that could negatively affect other species, and then in turn negatively affect us?
Yeah, I think we have to be asking these questions, right? Like the unintended consequences of our actions and tinkering around in nature. there can be grave consequences. Another example that I think is really striking in India. Basically, there's been widespread use of this anti-inflammatory drug called diclofenac in cattle to treat illnesses, right? So it's a very powerful anti-inflammatory drug. But as these cows then eventually died, the diclofenac was accumulating in the body of the cattle. And now typically vultures will prey upon these, or will scavenge and eat the dead carcasses. But the vultures, when they ate the carcasses filled with diclofenac, were actually then succumbing to death themselves, right? It was very toxic to the vultures. And then scientists have basically shown that, again, there's a link between that loss of vultures to increased human mortality. Because then you had carcasses that were decaying because vultures weren't around anymore. And then there's the hygiene issues and stuff like that, right? So again, everything is interrelated. And we have to remember that humans are a part of nature, not apart from nature, right? We're part of this ecosystem.
Yeah, one of my favorite concepts, or just sort of, anthro theory, is this idea that humans are part of nature too. So even our cities, even the cities that we live in, there's no such thing as a natural or unnatural world, because we have created it. So it is then, extension of us, and we are part of nature. So even urban spaces, and we've seen lots of animals, especially during COVID, thrive in urban spaces. We have to realize that there's going to be an uptick of also interaction with these animals, and not trying to eradicate them because they inconvenience us. Or even like when I met you, I lived in Red Hook, Brooklyn, and I lived in a garden apartment. It was in a basement. It was the water line was about 6'2" because of Sandy, it probably had lots of black mold. But I had infestations of cockroaches, but also house centipedes. And the first time I saw a giant house centipede, I thought, what the actual fuck is that? And I don't kill bugs. I just don't. So I was trying to understand the bug. Even cockroaches, I don't want to kill, because I also found out that when you kill cockroaches, it attracts the others. And I thought it was like a funeral procession, and it's no, they want to eat them. But anyways, real messed up. But it turns out that these house centipedes that are terrifying looking actually eat cockroach eggs. They actually do help keep your cockroach numbers down. So I was like, I just had like kind of an unspoken rule. Like, I'd see it. I'd be like, you can be here, but just hide yourself, please. Because you startled me. And I tried to just turn it around, like even I live amongst a lot of daddy long legs in my apartment. I name them, I give them their space, and send them on their mission to eat bugs.
Oh, I think that's such an awesome story. I've definitely seen my share of house centipedes in New York City. And so I did not know they eat the cockroach egg. But didn't you also have like a rooster or a chicken at some point? I mean, because when I was in Uganda, I had a chicken like at one point, and after it would rain, from our outhouse, all these cockroaches would come out, and the chicken would just go to town. And I was curious, did you have a similar experience?
So yeah, the chickens, Carol and Jeanette, you do remember? I don't know. Did you ever meet them? They were such special creatures. They were my quarantine. I always joke that it was magic mushrooms, and chickens that got me through the quarantine. So I'm not even sure if the chickens ever really existed. But yeah, they were amazing. And Jeanette, I called the ruthless assassin. Like I had to wrestle mice out of her throat because she would try to eat mice, and they would be too big, But so she'd eat anything, including cockroaches and centipedes. Carol, I called my big dumb blonde. I think her eyesight wasn't the best because I'd literally hold this fat hen right in front of a house centipede or a cockroach, and she would just stare like, like really cute and, kind of dopey. So yeah, one was good for that. The other one was just kind of useless. Carol started laying eggs on my desk though. So that was, it got weird.
Amazing.
Isn't that weird?
I love that. That is so cool.
Oh my.
Amazing though. And so I have newfound respect for house centipedes. That's so cool.
Yes. Yeah, because they serve a purpose. And so I want to, kind of get into how you made the leap that deforestation and, and pandemics are linked. Was this in your time, in Central and West Africa, that you were there for was it the Ebola outbreaks of 2015 and 14, right?
Yeah. So in 2014, I deployed to Liberia for CDC during the height of the Ebola epidemic in that country. And so that in West Africa, starting in 2013, the largest Ebola outbreak ever recognized basically took place, right? Over 11,000 people died in that Ebola outbreak. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen in terms of all the outbreak response I had done. And then a few years later in 2019, I deployed to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to assist in the response to the second largest Ebola outbreak ever, right? So I've done a fair amount of Ebola response work. But, one story I would say is that in 2013, before I had gone to Liberia for that Ebola response, I led an investigation with colleagues in Nigeria and with colleagues at CDC to investigate a bat festival that was taking place in this one rural part of Nigeria. And so,
Sorry.
yeah,
It was
and
wait, what do they, but like, what is the bat festival? Are they celebrating the bats? Are they?
it's celebrating in a way, right? So basically, there are these two
Uh-huh.
caves, and 2 times a year, people are allowed into these caves, and those are the only 2 times of the year that
Oh,
people are
okay.
allowed into caves, and it's only men and boys, okay? And the local king and his priest basically say now is the time of the year for the festival, and so.
Yeah.
These men and boys are running into the cave and they're swinging tree branches, knocking down bats and catching bats, that are flying around. And basically, these bats are then cooked and eaten. Okay.
Oh,
But these are Rosetta's aegypticus bats. And so when we heard about this festival taking place, our concern was that, well, maybe people are getting exposed to pathogens because Rosetta's aegypticus bats, the Egyptian fruit bat, are known reservoirs for Marburg virus in other parts of Africa. Marburg is a very deadly virus, a cousin of Ebola. And so, we went to Nigeria to basically do an investigation with our colleagues at the Nigerian Ministry of Health and with some Nigerian university collaborators. And, when we got to this one part of rural Nigeria, we first had to get permission from the local king to proceed with the investigation because all of this work always has to be done with community approval, community participation. And thankfully, we got that permission. And we were traveling around everywhere in bulletproof vehicles, like with glass that thick and with armed guards with AK-47s because of some of the instability in the area. And so we then trekked through the rainforest to get to the cave, and we're fully suited up as we go into the cave because we wanted to collect samples from the bats to understand what type of pathogens are in the bats. And so as you descend into the cave, all you can see is where your light is shining. And the floor is literally moving with like vermin, like, lizards, amphibians, insects, bats are flying all around. We also, of course, did surveys in the community to understand what type of precautions people are taking when they eat bats, when they catch bats. Do they have access to rabies vaccination? And we found some shocking things. First of all, we found that we discovered a new species of bacteria that was infecting people. We also the surveys represented over 2,000 people. 10% had come into contact with a bat in their lifetime. That's a really astronomically high number. But only 1% had ever received rabies vaccination before.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
What were the rabies rates there for humans? Was there any rate, or was it just? I mean, was anybody getting rabies?
And that's like one of the other things, because we were asking people, like, have you ever observed people getting sick after this festival? Are you yourself getting sick? Like, what type of outbreaks might be happening? And no one actually reported anything recently, an outbreak after this bat festival. And there might be a variety of different reasons for this that we don't know for sure. One possibility is that, sometimes outbreaks happen because of disturbances in nature, where suddenly a pathogen starts to spread in the bats and then people can start getting sick. And so, maybe we just had a snapshot in time when people were not getting sick. Maybe people have developed some type of genetic resistance to some of the local pathogens in those bats, right? That's purely speculation. But I'm just throwing out some ideas out there because we've seen other parts of the world where people have evolved with pathogens at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think of just sort of sickle cell and malaria and, thalassemia and malaria, and that there's a trade-off, if you will,
Absolutely. I'm so amazed with the breadth of your scientific knowledge. Like the fact that you can just
Thank you.
rattle off thalassemia and sickle cell. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. Exactly.
Well, it's funny. I taught biological anthropology, and we would talk. That was a specific, section we would talk about was just sickle cell anemia, and interestingly enough, I've had students that were sickle cell carriers, but they didn't have sickles. They were what is it? The heterozygous for sickle cell rather than homozygous, so they did not actually suffer from it. But so it's interesting when you run into people, and I've had professors that have had students that did have sickle cell, and so you got to be careful when you talk about this kind of scientific information, because you don't want to alienate or let them feel like we're kind of talking about them as if they're some sort of specimen, or even though they might not be open about it in class.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up that point. You're absolutely right. And I think the other thing to recognize is that I just described uh, this festival in this one part of Nigeria, right? And
Uh-huh.
maybe if we're based in the U.S., that practice might seem a little bit different or foreign to us. But I also would remind people that there
Oh,
are things that we do in the U.S. that would seem odd to other people in the world, right? Like,
yes.
and so it's all relative. And the point here is that we want people to be safe.
Yeah.
Right. At the end of the day, we activities are happening. We all do risky things in our lives. As soon as I step out on the streets of New York City, there's a risk every time I go on the streets, right? I
Oh,
take
yes.
precautions, or I'm driving in icy conditions. I wear seatbelts, right? We all do risky things. And so it's not to point fingers at people, but it's about
Yeah.
reducing risk.
Absolutely. And cultural relativism is a big thing in anthropology, of course, wanting to not be ethnocentric and throw shade at something you don't quite understand. Because that is, that othering that we see, unfortunately, a lot here in this country. And we want to stay away from that because, like, for instance, people that judge what people eat, like I don't eat meat, but there's a lot of people in different parts of the country that eat all sorts of animals that I might find, oh, that's a little not side that doesn't coincide with my values, but also like we eat animals that maybe they'd be like, what the heck, why would you do that? So it really is uh relative, and like you said, it's about heading off any sort of risk. Like for instance, I think of HIV, for instance, which for years there was um this sort of rumor going around that it came from someone who had sex with a monkey. It was this, this big sort of rumor when I was growing up in the late 80s, early 90s. But we now know it's from, SIV and eating primates. And I don't know if you have you ever done any work with HIV or SIV?
A little bit with HIV, just in terms of
Mhm.
clinical practice, but not directly with SIV.
Yeah. Yeah. But another example of misconceptions. Hold on one second. I think we have a question real quick. John Hogan, how does someone go where Ebola is at its worst and prepare so they don't catch it?
You know,
Good question.
yeah. Thank you for this question. And so, as a CDC disease detective, quite often by the time we're going to one of these areas that are impacted by some outbreak, it's actually much safer because we already often know what we're dealing with or we're taking precautions. The people who are the real heroes in all of this type of work are the people who are on the front lines actually treating patients. So in many parts of the world where tropical diseases persist, there are limited resources. So, I'll think of my time when I was in Liberia. I was working in this very rural part of Liberia, and there was a community care center for people with Ebola. And one night, I wake up the next morning and the community care center had run out of rubber gloves. Now,
Oh,
how can you be a nurse in that center taking care of people without Ebola when you don't have any gloves, right? And so the point I'm trying to make is that the people who are often at greatest risk are the clinicians, the nurses, the doctors, the other healthcare professionals. And it's in various Ebola outbreaks, including the ones that I've had the honor of helping to respond to. Healthcare workers are some of the people who are most impacted, who are dying at higher rates than other people because they're getting exposed and they don't have the equipment. But the other thing I'll say is, so I just gave an example of how resources suddenly disappeared in the setting of that Ebola outbreak. And that's one of the reasons the virus kept spreading. But if you fast forward a few years, okay, now it's 2020 and the COVID pandemic is taking off in New York City, right, where I was living at the time. And we were one of the worst hit jurisdictions in all of the country during that first wave. And one of my closest friends from residency reached out to me one day and asked me if I had any extra N95 respirators to share with her because there were not enough at the hospital. And the crazy thing is that maybe around 5-6 months before, I was in the Congo for an Ebola outbreak, and I had been given a pack of supplies so that I could stay safe. So I still had some leftover N95 respirators from that Ebola response. And so I gave her what I had left. But it was just a reminder. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, even in one of the richest cities in the world, we're all the same. Infectious diseases are equalizers. And
yeah.
just like in Liberia, people ran out of resources and the Ebola virus spread. Well, in New York City, we ran out of resources and COVID was spreading.
Oh God. No, I'm like having flashbacks because, a lot of our friends are doctors, and I would hear, ERs, like, our emergency rooms just having a shortage of masks and just the hell that was going on. It is, woo. Yeah. And even like we talk about it being an equalizer, to an extent, because we also see, and this is why I think it's such a, intersectional problem, who was more affected in terms of COVID. It was oftentimes marginalized communities, who were frontline workers, perhaps worked in a store that didn't close down or couldn't be remote, because they were, working as part of the metro system or whatever, So, I mean, these are things that I always, oh, yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Right
Woo!
there, there's so many equity issues, and we saw disproportionate impacts of COVID across the city. Even if you rewind back to Zika in 2016, we
Oh
found,
my gosh. Yeah.
yeah, like when Zika first emerged in the Western Hemisphere, and we recognized that it was causing these birth defects, the rates of testing for Zika virus in pregnant people were higher in some of the most affluent areas of the city, but these were not the areas where a lot of travel was happening to and from affected parts of the world. And because we weren't having local transmission of
Yeah.
Zika virus through mosquitoes. And so it's just a reminder about equity. But one of the things I'm really pleased to report, right? Because I had the privilege of leading New York City's COVID contact tracing team. I had
Yes.
over 3,000 people. We traced over 700,000 New Yorkers. But as we built that team of 3,000 contact tracers, we intentionally hired people that from areas of the city that were more heavily impacted by COVID. And this was part of our efforts to have an equitable response so that the people who were hit so hard as COVID ripped through the city had more access to some of the jobs to help us get back on our feet. And I'm just so grateful for the team that signed on during such a traumatizing, difficult time. I'm really proud of the work that we did, and I hope that we made a significant impact for the city.
Oh, so I'm very excited because this is a big part of the interview that I was very hyped about because I wanted to know when I first met you, I remember it was, a time when, COVID was surging and it was, how can you contact trace in New York City? How did you do this? How was this?
Yeah, I mean, it our ability to do that contact tracing represents decades of investment in the public health infrastructure of New York City
Yeah.
and across New York State. Right? These are not things that you can do overnight. And if these systems get dismantled, then we lose our ability to respond going forward. But the backbone of public health is surveillance, disease surveillance. And so there are certain diseases that by law have to be reported to public health authorities, right? Either through the laboratory systems or through clinical practices. But the laboratory system reporting is in many ways automated, right? So if a laboratory test is run on a patient and it turns out to be positive for that list of reportable diseases, including HIV, syphilis, chlamydia, right? If a test is positive, it automatically gets reported to the health department. And so that's how we
Those are all
build
the fun ones.
Right, yeah. So then we have we have a database though of who has these diseases. We have information about them, and that's basically the universe of people that we began our contact tracing operation with. We knew who was testing positive for COVID, so we could reach out to them, and we would then talk to them and find out, okay, well, where were you in those days preceding the onset of your symptoms, even after the symptoms started, and they would give us a list of names. And then we would follow up with those people because they would give us the contact information. Now, sometimes
Yeah.
these people would be in public settings, right? They wouldn't be able to report everyone that they had come in contact with, right? And that's where there's holes in the contact tracing. Ideally, right, when you're doing contact tracing, every new case is ideally already on a list of known contacts that you have. And if you have 100% match there, then your contact tracing is robust. But if you're identifying new cases that are not on your list of contacts, that means that there's a lot of unrecognized transmission happening.
Right.
And
Yeah.
the outbreak is not under control.
I mean, I just think of the subway. I think because that never really stopped running. We had chunks of time that, they would clean the subway, by the way, was the cleanest it's ever been. I've ever seen it during COVID. I mean, you could have eaten off those seats. It was so clean because I think they closed from I got stuck a couple times, because I had to work and it's like 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. I think they closed it down to do that. But during the day, there was still, I mean, and people tried to social distance, but it's hard. So, I mean, how many people total were you able to, I guess, contact trace?
We traced over 700,000 affected New Yorkers.
Wow.
Yeah, and so that was during my time overseeing the program, because then I left by March of 2021. It was a huge effort, and again, like, the team I had working with me was incredible. There were three things that kept me going during that, because I've done outbreak response around the world, but nothing I've done comes close to the difficulty of that experience. When the mayor tapped me, it was May 6th of 2020.
Wow.
And the assignment was basically to get over 2,000 people hired and get the contact tracing program running by June 1st. So less than 1 month. And I had the most incredible people working alongside me. And so the three things that got me through it, number one was the mission. I love New York City, right? That's my place. And, to give back to the city that I love was a huge honor. Number two was the people that I worked with, right? These are people that sacrifice so much, and they rose to they answered the call of duty. And I will always love them for the sacrifices they made. And number three is my partner, Jill, who basically made it all possible. She took care of every aspect of my life that I didn't have to think about. So all I would do is wake up, work, go to sleep. But like, she just took care of me, and I can never thank her enough for making it possible. And so, yeah.
Jill's amazing. I'm just gonna say it. I freaking love Jill. She's the best. So your wife, no, I actually, she does really cool work. I would love to have her on one day too. Perhaps it could be a partner duo one day.
Oh yeah, maybe
that would be. We could invite Ragnar and Kitty Cat. It could be a party. Yeah, no, it was a weird time. I just think back because I moved back to LA, and it almost feels like a dream when I think back to those days of just such uncertainty. And so thank you for doing what you did, because, it really did help, I think, New Yorkers feel safer, just kind of understanding what the hell's going on, because, yeah.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, but thanks right back to you. There is such an important role for science communication, and I think that was one of the lapses that could have been done better, right? Like how the information was communicated. Science, unfortunately, took a big hit during the pandemic, and I think there's a lot of work that we need to do to communicate how science is done.
Absolutely,
and that's where people like you are so important. So a huge thanks to you.
Thank you. It was tough because I remember making some TikToks about COVID, and it was all, peer-reviewed evidence. It was about when the vaccine was coming out, I think in 2021. I talked to some of our other friends who are also epidemiologists to basically make sure everything I'm saying is, correct. And it was taken down. I was community guideline violating by talking about this, even though it was not telling anybody to do anything. It was just like, here's information, I present it. So there was a bit of a war on that. And I also think that, and I've talked about this with a lot of science communicators about how do we better teach that science is a process and more of a verb than a noun early on, because I think a lot of people were really feeling just mistrustful of science because they were like, it's always changing. It's always changing. They said this one day and this the other. And it's like, yes, because we've gathered more information. Good science will change. It's not static and fixed. We're not sitting here. It's not like, say, religion where, you kind of, it stays still and this is the way it is. And that's the way it's going to be. Science should continue as we gain information to shift and change. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. So I'm hoping, I interviewed the director of the National Center of Science Education a few weeks ago about this. And she was, we talked about the importance of, getting that into elementary school, right? So kids, like critical thinking and like, it's okay that things maybe are one thing one day and then change the next. So that would make your job easier and my job.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, though. I think that it has to start at a very early stage, including in the primary school level. You're absolutely right about that.
Yeah. So I want to get back to uh, God, it's so funny. Just like it's like a flashback going back to New York City during 2020. I'm thinking of Carol and Jeanette, my house chickens. But yeah, I want to get to your conservation work and the fact that now you are really looking at the intersection of, climate change, deforestation, and pandemics. And how did that come about? And how does deforestation affect pandemics?
So, I've responded to so many different outbreaks of zoonotic viruses, right? So viruses that originate in animals and then jump into people, we call that spillover. And research shows that the number of infectious diseases that are emerging has increased decade after decade since the 1940s. And that most of these new infectious diseases are the result of spillovers. So they start in animals, then they jump into people. And spillovers are on the rise because of human activities such as deforestation, the commercial wildlife trade pipeline, unsafe practices when raising farmed animals, and then climate changes in the backdrop of all of that, right? So, I'm not talking about once a pathogen is in people, the factors that then allow it to spread easily between people, such as global travel. But I'm just focused on the fact that we are doing things to the planet that increase the chances that viruses will jump from animals into people. And so that's the focus of my work, right? So I got tired of responding to outbreaks rather than preventing them. I found that we weren't talking enough about prevention, which is why I made the hard decision to leave CDC, an agency that I love, and colleagues that I love working with, so that I could work in the nonprofit space to basically advocate for the protection of nature to prevent outbreaks. And to your point about like how does something like deforestation drive infectious disease emergence? Well,
Yeah.
there's a few different reasons, right? The first reason is that when we first have to recognize that forests have a lot of biodiversity, meaning a lot of variety of life, including microbial life. Now, biodiversity in and of itself, it's not what causes pandemics. Rather, it is actions that humans take that disturb that biodiversity that then leads to the spillovers. Okay, actions again such as deforestation. So when you deforest, you create this edge of forest, and along that edge, people and domestic animals have more opportunities to interact with wildlife. That creates the physical interface that allows spillover to happen. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is just like people, when we're stressed, we're more likely to get sick. The same goes for wildlife. When they're stressed because they're losing their habitat, they're more likely to get sick, shed pathogens that can then infect us. Reason number three is that deforestation leads to loss of biodiversity. Now, some species are specialist species and they're only evolved to live in that forest. And so as the forest disappears, those species disappear.
Yeah.
But other species are generalists and they can live alongside people. They can live in a number of different environments. But those same animals tend to be ones that can carry pathogens that can then go on to infect us. And then reason number four is climate change. So deforestation is an independent driver of climate change. And climate change independently increases the risk of infectious disease emergence.
God, it's all connected. All of it.
Connected.
Oh
All
my
connected.
God.
I mean,
No,
when
yeah.
well, I'm wondering, like in all the work that you were doing with primates around the world, have you seen infectious diseases play out in these primates?
Well, that's the funny. I mean, that's yes and no. Okay, so I know that I have not worked with macaques closely because macaques terrify me. I always joke it's people ask is there going to be Planet of the Apes one day, and I have to correct them. Actually, we're living in Planet of the Apes because humans are great apes. We're part of the family Hominidae. But beyond that, if there was going to be a primate that would take over the world, it would be macaques because they can survive. They're the second most widely distributed primate in the world, and they can just survive anywhere. And I believe, I have to double check. I feel like they are, or maybe it's vervet monkeys. There's a monkey that is resistant to Marburg, I believe. I feel like there's one primate. I don't want to misspeak, but I do know that monkey or macaques can carry herpes B, and that is very deadly to humans. So it's do not touch the monkey. Like it's one thing to say, you got. I went out of town and I went to Florida because there's a lot of us, escaped ones that live in the swamps of Florida. I don't know how I got this herpes. I was, I was in Florida and a monkey attacked me, but it's like, nobody's going to believe that, especially because you're going to die because herpes B is deadly. So, there's that. And then also when I studied spider monkeys, I was just thinking when you were talking about the deforestation and the perhaps the contact with maybe livestock with wild animals, because where I worked in Panama, it's the Azuero Peninsula. It's on the Pacific coast. It's one of the most heavily deforested areas of Panama. And it was basically creating islands on a landscape. And the spider monkeys had nowhere to go to shtup other ones, So all of a sudden you've got inbreeding depression. You've got, just, low numbers of spider monkeys. And basically their corridors were living fences. Those little tiny sparse living fences you might see if you go to Central America that are just little trees connected to each other. But there was a lot of cattle that were interacting with, they're on the forest line. But I haven't heard anything specifically in regards to that. I was looking up different parts of Central America that have had some spillover, but fortunately, knock on wood, I don't know of anything specifically with the Azuero spider monkey. But
sorry, go on.
No.
Well, I like your point though about the macaques, right? Don't touch the macaques, right? Like when I see photos of tourists in like places like Bali and there's like monkeys crawling on, climbing all over them, I just get terrified.
Their face is next. You know what I mean? Like they're so smart. They're so smart. And they can survive, like you were saying that. So I studied, the spider monkey, which is more of a specialist. They're frugivores. They eat mostly fruit, whereas, the generalist is like a macaque, right? Macaques will eat anything, including your face and your fingers and your soul, so just don't touch them, but like also the pet trade is a problem, when we see or bush meat and pet trade, right? So when we see animals that are bought and sold, whether it's trying to be smuggled into different areas of the world as pets or bush meat, that can be a problem and too with spreading zoonotic diseases. So again, this is where humans who might need to make money, and I understand that. And this is why I think conservation needs to be people first. Jane talks about that a lot, Jane Goodall, about making sure people have their needs met, and then they won't have to resort to things that might, ruin a population of primates.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It has to be people first in any conservation effort. And I think in the past, conservationists have made that mistake about separating parcels of land away from people. And, many indigenous peoples are actually have been historically displaced from the lands, even though they are the best custodians of these lands.
The best stewards. Yep.
Yeah. And so we have to be supporting their tenure rights and yeah, it's just tragic, some of the legacy of conservation. And I hope that we're on a better track going forward, putting people in conservation together. It has to be a partnership.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't think of any conservation efforts that were just from an outside source. They were always included the local population, or because that's how you're going to get people invested, people who are going to protect, people who are going to have financial gain from these efforts. That we see that with like Virunga National Park. A lot of the rangers are reformed. I don't know if it's a lot, probably, I know at least some are reformed poachers, people that actually used to go into the forest and poach, but, they also now know what to look for, right? Because they were once on that side and now they are stewards of their land and very proud of it. And so, I mean, that right there is an example of conservation done right. Although it is interesting just, thinking about the potential for any sort of zoonotic transition or transmission in that particular instance. But as far as I know, there's also precaution and education about don't get too close, stay away, keep a distance, which I think is also very important.
Yeah, it's a tough balance, right? Like bringing people in from around the world into these areas. They could potentially get exposed and then carry the pathogen out with them. At the same time, no intervention is perfect, right? It's a risk-benefit analysis. And many of these areas would disappear were it not for ecotourism. And then in the process of losing those ecosystems, we'd actually have even more risk of infectious disease emergence, right? So it's a good thing that we're finding ways for people to make money off of nature. But, your point about like the trade of wildlife is one that is something that I'm very focused on and concerned about. And one thing to make clear is that one of the largest, if not the largest importer of wildlife in the world is the United States. And the first ever recognized outbreak of mpox outside of the continent of Africa happened here in the United States, right? You might remember in 2022, mpox was all over the headlines related to sexual transmission when this new clade was recognized, basically, that was being transmitted sexually. Well, before that, if you rewind to 2003, this is after the 9/11 terrorist attack and after the anthrax attacks, right? When there was already heightened vigilance around the threat of bioterrorism, including from poxviruses, such as smallpox virus. Well, suddenly people in the Midwest started showing up with all these lesions that kind of looked like smallpox. And it turned out that they actually had mpox related to exposure from rodents and prairie dogs. And so Gambian rats had been imported into the United States as part of the pet trade. And some of those were infected with mpox. It got into prairie dogs and it spread across the Midwest. And so, we're all interconnected.
Oh my God.
We have these demands, but there is no reason in urban centers such as New York City, Wuhan, Paris, London, why you need to be having the sale of live wild birds and mammals, right? Because they're purely for luxury. That's what we need to be regulating. I'm not talking about infringing on the rights of local communities from accessing wildlife, the rights of people to hunt or whatever else. I'm just talking about commercial trade of wildlife.
Absolutely. No, I 100% stand behind that because, so many of them die anyways, but the threat of a pandemic is really looming. I wanted to one of the things that you said in your TED talk was the importance, and it's kind of getting back to it has to be people first, of radical listening when it comes to dealing with a community that might be dealing with deforestation or dealing with maybe a threat of a pandemic. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that and how that maybe plays a role in how you attack things now.
We talked a moment ago about the historic problems in conservation, about separating people out and how that was a big problem. We've seen something similar in public health, historically, where communities are not engaged in the public health process. And you can't be successful without a partnership with communities, right? The communities are the experts in their own community, not me as some academic, person. And I'll give you a story. Last year, was it last year? Yeah, I think it was last year. I was in Samburu County in Kenya as part of this convening that brought together experts in health and environmental conservation and finance from across the continent of Africa and also other parts of the world, right? So it was like 40 or 50 experts convening in this one part of Samburu County. Gorgeous area of Kenya, just rolling rangelands, and there's elephants and giraffes, and it was just absolutely amazing.
That's amazing.
And we're meeting, and like our meetings are happening in the bush, and they said don't wander off to go pee or whatever else because you can get run over by an elephant. And so it was an incredible setting, right? But I remember the first night we're at dinner, or it's like getting dark, and we're at the hotel overlooking this gorgeous landscape, and it's getting dark, and all of a sudden there's a thud, and we look over to the side, and there's a bat on the floor. And it wasn't clear, why it fell out of the air. But our guide, this indigenous person, a member of the Samburu tribe, basically reached over and picked up the bat and moved it to a corner. So I went to go meet him right after that on the side. I said, hey, bats can carry illnesses or pathogens that can infect you. And, maybe this bat was sick or something like that. So you might want to wash your hands. And so he said, okay, sure. And he went ahead and did that. So the next night, exact same time, right? It's like dusk, it's getting dark. And, we're all waiting for dinner. And we look down at one of the feet of my colleagues, and there's a tick on her foot. And, ticks can carry pathogens as well, right? And so suddenly the same guy, right? That same guy from the night before jumps into action, and he literally rips the tick off and is about to squeeze it with his fingers. And we're like, no. If you squeeze it, you might release the pathogens. If it has any, it's better to put it on the side and, crush it
some
with a
water.
rock. Yeah,
Yeah.
or something like that. And so, he goes ahead and does that. And then he turns to me and my colleague and he looks at us and smiles and he goes, I've been touching bats since I was a kid. And I've been ripping ticks off of cattle with my teeth since I was a kid. And I've never gotten sick. And that was a reminder for me in that moment, right? Here I am, some New Yorker in this man's land. If he had put me out there at that time of night for 15 minutes, I would have died. I can't survive on the land. And here I am telling him how to function, what to do, right? And so I'm not saying that, okay, it's okay not to wash your hands after touching a bat or something like that. But I'm just saying we have to approach these interactions with humility and partnership with communities. And this is where radical listening comes in, right? So this is an approach that this NGO Health in Harmony has pioneered. And they've done incredible work. I used to be on their board, right? But they've done incredible work in Indonesian Borneo, for example, where basically the founder, Kinnari, is a medical doctor. And when she was younger, she was doing work with orangutans in Indonesia. But she realized families were engaging in deforestation just to generate income to meet their basic needs, like healthcare. So she set up this nonprofit to basically implement community design solutions to deforestation. And communities were saying that we need clinics, we need education for our children, we need alternative jobs so that we don't have to deforest. So that's what our nonprofit did. It built a clinic, it built a school, and as a result of that, there was a decline in infant mortality, lower rates of TB, tuberculosis, malaria, diarrheal disease, and at the same time, deforestation rates dropped. Right? So it's
great.
People and planet don't need to be in conflict.
Absolutely. No, there's a way to find that happy place, but I love a happy ending like that. That makes me it gives us hope, right? Like this is, you're the harbinger of hope.
There's hope all around us, right? Like a lot of bad things are happening in the world right now. There's no doubt, climate change, pandemics, a mass extinction. But I've actually never been more hopeful for the world, right? People are so aware of what's happening in the United States, right? Like people are tired of the status quo. Whether or not we like the outcome of this election, it's clear that people across the country want a shakeup. And that's clearly what we need in the United States and around the world. And I think there are better ways to do this and worse ways to do that, certainly. But what I'm happy about is that people are aware. And if you engage in the stages of change model, this is like the pre-contemplation, the contemplation stage, and this is like the precursor for what I think is transformational change. And one thing I'd add on this topic of hope that Willow Diefbau, this amazing writer and editor-in-chief of Atmos magazine, has said before, the planet is dying, right? It's in bad condition. It's in critical condition. But like if you have a loved one and they have terminal cancer, you're not going to just abandon them and leave them to die, right? You're going to take care of them and you're going to love them to the very end. And our planet is in distress right now. But that's not a reason for us to throw up our hands and say, screw it. Right? I'm not going to care, right? We need to lean into that love and take action. And I have found that action is the best antidote to despair, right? There are solutions all around us. And so Clover Hogan, one of the people that I follow and I just admire her so much, has said that we do not need 100 perfect activists. We need 1 million imperfect activists, right? We all have a role.
Yeah.
Just find our area and let's make a difference.
Absolutely. Oh, I love that. I love that. Well, what are some actionable things that people can do in their own community? Is there anything that you can think of that maybe you do or you think others can?
I think there's something for all of us, right? So find the topic area that we care about. And again, don't remember that you don't have to be perfect, right? So maybe your action, you start off with composting, or maybe you decide that you're going to use more public transport or eat less meat or whatever it is, right? But many of these actions that we take for the planet are also good for our own health, right? So it's kind of like a 2-for-1 deal.
Right.
Yeah. And then it's also about becoming aware, right? Like, again, I'm just so impressed with the way you communicate science, right? And so we should all lean in and learn more and like listen to people like you, right? And become informed. As we become informed, we realize that, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, but it's actually possible to create the change that we want to see in the world.
Oh, thank you. No, this is the whole point of the show, is to have you on to tell us how, you're making great leaps and bounds to make the world better, and, kind of connect the dots. Because I think sometimes it's really, we like to compartmentalize so much that we forget how everything is connected. And, things like climate change, that it's really easy to just put our heads in the sand and be like, I can't think about it. But also like, no, it's affecting all these parts of our life. And how can we contribute in small ways? Like you said, use public transportation, eat less meat, something, turn the lights off. I don't know, and little things that can make a big impact, because it doesn't always happen. Rome wasn't built in a day, right? So
Absolutely.
yeah. I know that we're on such a hopeful kick, but I do want to address just the confirmation of RFK Jr. as, the head of the HSS, and like how does that, what are your biggest fears perhaps, or your thoughts on it? Do you have any maybe concerns about how this will affect vaccine access, or even maybe anti-science movements?
Well, one thing I would remind everyone is that this is one election in one country in one moment in time, right? This is what
Hmm.
one of my mentors has said before, Sunjin, the CEO of Conservation International. And, we have to remember that things can change. Now, I disagree with RFK on a lot of stuff. For example, he has denied the link between HIV and AIDS. He has peddled a lot of incorrect information on vaccines, promoting raw milk at a time when avian influenza is spreading, right? Like, these are all very concerning features for the head of the Department of Health and Human Services. At the same time, there is something he has tapped into, and I think he has this opportunity that very few other people have ever had before, right? I've never come across a head of HHS, Health and Human Services, that's this much of a household name, right? Like, most of us don't know who the prior HHS secretary was, or the one before that, but we all
I had to look it up.
Right. Yeah. But
I was like, who are these people?
Exactly. Right. Well, RFK is a household name, and he's
Mhm.
tapped into something, right? The Make America Healthy Again movement that he's led
Mm.
has pluralities of both parties supporting it, which is interesting,
Which
right?
it is. It's the far left and the far right. Oftentimes, the anti, like for instance, Santa Monica, California, on one of the more liberal areas of California, had one of the highest rates of anti-vaxxers. This is about 8 or so years ago. So, but there was, a big push for making sure that non-vax kids could go to public school. But, fortunately, it was put into law that you actually have to have your kid vaccinated, which upset a lot of parents. But, at the same time, like, we had to do what's best for everybody that's going to these schools, kids and, their teachers, because some of them are immunocompromised. Some of the kids are.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we have an outbreak right now, a major outbreak of measles right now happening in Texas, mostly impacting unvaccinated kids. Almost 1 in 5 of those kids are ending up in the hospital, right? So it is a concerning time. But again, it's not just people on the extremes of the left and right that are behind RFK and the Make America Healthy Again movement. And I
Mhm.
think he's tapped into is this concern that people have across the country that what that there's this awful rise in chronic disease. That's true.
Mhm.
That American health outcomes aren't great, and that we're getting exposed to a lot of toxic substances, right? This idea that what's happening around us is actually impacting our body. And I think that's a really important insight. Now,
Yes.
maybe some of that energy is getting channeled in the wrong way, right? Like, there's a lot of focus on like red 40 maybe, and things that perhaps are less of a public health issue than the fact that we are burning fossil fuels and creating a lot of air pollution that kills millions of people prematurely around the world, or that we have too much salt in our food, right? And hypertension is an epidemic in this country, and
Yeah.
that's really what's killing people. But again, I'm just really happy that people are now increasingly understanding that what's happening around us impacts our own health. And I hope that leads people to then a, a greater understanding that what's happening to nature is actually impacting our own health. Right? So I disagree with RFK on some of his stances, but I also think he has a huge opportunity ahead of him to actually make an impact because he is a really prominent environmental activist, at least back in the day.
I'm just hoping that some of that gets through, given all the, national park layoffs and firings that, I am worried about, I have a lot of friends that work in parks, and I just, there is a concern there. So I'm hoping that we can find some sort of balance, and I just know that, especially with like the war on the MMR vaccine in his mind, I that's what really worries me when I see like a measles outbreak, in Texas. And I know that my mom, who may or may not be watching, hello, mom, she does not have the immunity. She grew up in a time when, there was measles around, and it's thought that she would have acquired immunity just from being around it, but she does not have it, the immunity. So she had got one of the she got the first one, and she'd never got the second one. So I'm like, please get the second one.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Get it.
It's such a contagious disease, measles. It's probably the most contagious virus
Really?
that we know of. Yeah,
Oh,
it's absolutely contagious. And even after a person with measles has left a room for 2 hours later, the virus can be lingering in the air. And so
what
it
a
is,
jerk.
it's
Yeah.
awful, right? And that's why, back in the day, many people were dying of measles. People still die because when it spreads that widely, some percentage is going to actually have the very severe consequences. And like I said, right, in this outbreak in Texas right now, nearly 1 in 5 children are getting hospitalized. That's not
Terrible.
that's awful. And so I want to be very clear, right? Like there's bad things that I foresee happening because of the rise in anti-science and some of the stances that I think RFK has promoted. And we can rattle off that list, right? Like the
Samoan outbreak.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah.
So, but there's also an important role for all of us as citizens for speaking our mind, right? Like that's what you're doing, right? I'm communicating. Other people I see on social media like are communicating. We have to spread the message. We should do it with empathy and with love, right? Rather than pointing fingers and attacking. I think like that way we can all have intelligent conversations and we're not belittling people. And our voices make a difference, right? Like we've seen in the last few weeks where public uproar led to backtracking of certain policies that would have been really detrimental.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like a lot of these executive orders were not technically legal. So therefore, the more loud and robust and the pushback that we give, oh, there goes my light. That's how excited I was. The more pushback we give, the more likely we're going to see, things get rolled back, because I think it's a bit of a shock and awe campaign rather than this is what, or a distraction, right? And so let's not get ourselves distracted, because I think these things are meant to sort of paralyze us and from acting. And I agree. I think acting is, even if it's small little measures, is what we need to do more than anything. Keep that going.
And you're absolutely right. Like, try not to get overwhelmed, right? Like, do what it takes to center yourself. Like, if it's a meditation practice or some type of spiritual practice, right? And then focus on the areas that mean the most to you. But it's very easy otherwise to get overwhelmed.
Well, that brings me to my next question, because I know that you do jujitsu. And is that how because how do you de-stress after all that you're doing? Because you're doing so much. Like what chills you out?
Yeah, I stumbled upon jujitsu in an unusual way, a sad way actually. Like it was back in 2018 after the Pulse nightclub shooting.
Oh wow.
It was awful, right? And so our workplace, I was at the New York City Health Department at the time, made us take a training on if a lone shooter came into the workplace, like how would we handle it? And which was like they ended up hiring these like ex-Marines who were so intense and scared the bejesus out of all of us. It was like,
wait, they actually did like a simulation?
Well, they got these like 3 or 4 former Marines who like gave the talk, and at the end they showed us like moves as a last resort or what you do. And like I just like people who are really intense. And so I just started talking to them after, and they're like, you know what, if you want to do self-defense, you got to learn either Muay Thai or Jiu-Jitsu. And I took a Jiu-Jitsu class and I just fell in love instantly. Like,
oh my gosh.
Yeah. I know you do martial arts too, right?
Yeah. I used to, I kickbox from like age 9 to 15. It was karate, but my sensei, it was a little cult like, I'm gonna be honest. I still remember our motto. It was Chosen Ryu is a hard hitting, no holds bar of martial art, emphasizing in bold tactical ingenuity and street proven techniques of self defense. It is physically demanding and a mentally intensive approach to training. I mean, and it went on from there. It was crazy, but it went from being more Kempo styles, that had less practical applications really, to turning into street fighting. Like we would fight in the dark with knives. Like they were plastic knives but still sharp, and we'd put chalk on them. Like the evolution, like this was my introduction to evolution, I think, because it was cultural evolution, but still the way that this dojo changed into like, grappling, and we learned how to break necks at age 10. It was bonkers. But yeah, I still remember a lot of it. So, it's good for de-stressing for sure.
Yeah, you're one person I would never want to like get in a fight with. I feel like you just destroy me in a moment.
I don't know.
Yeah. Like I definitely would not want to mess with you. I'm terrible at jujitsu, but I love it. And yeah, absolutely, it's my release, right? Like I go there and I don't think about the world. And the other thing, so apart from it being an escape, the cool thing about jujitsu is that I've never been in a place that brings people from so many different walks of life together.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, like even when I'm in the hospital, right? Like a lot of us are of a certain level of, advanced education or whatever else, right? Even though there is a wide spectrum of people that are working together, but like on the mat in jujitsu, people from all types of walks of life, and
Yeah.
there's so much trust, right? Like I'm trusting you not to break my arm. I'm trusting you not to like break my neck, right? Like stuff like that. Random people that I know
Yeah.
really nothing about. And the mats don't lie, right? Like on the mats, like everyone is the same and we train. And yeah, I've had incredible time in the last like 6 years training. I
That's
love it.
so cool. They don't have a belt system or something like that, right? It's
There
just
is a belt system.
okay, there
Yeah.
is. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah. So there's 5 belts, white, blue, purple, brown, black.
Mm.
And then, so I'm just on blue.
That's
But
great. No,
yeah,
I mean, look, it's not like you're not busy. I mean, it's not like you're off saving the world and whatnot.
yeah.
It's hard to
No.
hard to find time. That's so cool. I miss kickboxing. Sometimes I want to, take it back up again. Go hit a bag.
So what's your escape
Oh,
thing, or what's your
I mean,
thing?
oh dear Lord. I think you might, I don't know if you know this. I do science comedy burlesque now. So I've been
Yeah.
doing burlesque, and it's so much fun. It's such a good, I love dancing. I always have, but the motto is community over competition. So
Oh,
talk about, a departure from science and the film industry, which is all about like, cutthroat. I'm going to
yeah.
publish this first. I'm going to book this job, whereas this is just like we want to see everybody rise. So that's
No.
been, yeah, it's been a great joy. But I mean, aside from that, I mean, I love being in nature. Like I miss when I worked in Panama. I still say those were my happiest days of my life, just walking out the door and being in the forest. And, I'm thinking of, trying how to get back there. We'll see.
Yeah. Oh, that's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. I would be remiss not to ask, because I know people are going to want to know if you have any thoughts of what's going on with bird flu right now.
It's concerning, extremely concerning, right? This is a virus that, in large part, has emerged because of our food production systems, right? Over the last few decades, we've allowed this virus to evolve, and we've not implemented proper control measures, right? So the whole public health space is underfunded. And since 1918, we've had 4 flu pandemics that have killed over 50 million people.
Dear Lord.
The worst one, again, was the 1918 flu. So that accounts for most of those deaths, right? But the thing with flu is that it can spread widely. It can have very high mortality rates. And so the worry here is that avian flu right now, which is spreading in many, many different types of animals, right? And causing mass mortality, right? There's even an outbreak in Argentinian elephant seal pups that killed over 90% of those Argentinian elephant seal pups last year. Like,
What?
yeah, it's crazy. And it's just so
Oh.
deadly, right? The number of animals that it's capable of infecting. Now, it's also infected people. Thankfully, it's not spreading from person to person. And so we're not right now experiencing a pandemic, but there's always a risk. Every time it jumps from animals into people, it can pick up a mutation. Actually, a report last year in, I think, Nature or Science showed that it's basically only 1 or 2 mutations away from developing the ability to spread from person to person.
Oh
And
dear.
yeah, and so this is awful. And I think we're worse
Yeah.
off in 2025 than we were in 2020 when it comes to addressing the next pandemic. Because
Wow.
healthcare workers are tired. There's less trust in institutions, right? Like people don't want to deal with another pandemic. So if avian flu becomes a pandemic, I really worry about how it's going to be handled.
Got it. Wow. I mean, is there anything, I guess, do you know of anything in the works to try to even create some sort of vaccine for what exists now in livestock?
Yeah, so there already is a livestock, like a poultry vaccine, and there's talk about vaccinating poultry widely for this.
Hmm.
There is a stockpile in the United States that includes a human vaccine for avian flu. Hopefully, the match will still work
Right.
if it ever needs to get used. There are actions that need to happen for the interfaces where the spillover is most likely to happen, right? That starts with protecting workers. We saw during
Yeah.
COVID, and we're seeing right now that workers often don't have the equipment they need. They don't have the access to healthcare they need. So we need to be making sure that they have healthcare access and personal protective equipment. Number one, we need to be doing a better job with how we raise farm animals, right? They're put in these awful, awful conditions. That's inhumane for the animal, but it's also bad for our health, right? Like
It's so bad.
it's so bad, right? And
Terrible.
we've created these genetically homogenous populations of, for example, chickens, that if one of them is susceptible, then probably all of them are susceptible. And they're getting pumped full of antibiotics because there's so much transmission of pathogens between them. They're standing around in their feces, right? Like these are just, no one wants to eat that. It's
No.
not good for the animals. It's not good for us. So let's do a better job, and let's put regenerative agriculture on the same footing as industrial scale animal farms that have gotten subsidies for many, many years. And so these are some of the things that I think we could be doing, that we should be doing.
Absolutely. I'm a big, I've been vegetarian pretty much since 1995, for just because I love animals, and that's, I don't judge other people for what they eat, but I do have massive concerns with how livestock has been raised and factory farming here in the US. I live, and if you went from San Francisco to Los Angeles, you've driven the 5 and you know about Cowshowitz or
Yeah.
Coalinga, which is a huge cattle ranch that I mean, it stretches. I mean, I'm sure it's multiple cattle ranches, but it just smells of death, and it's troubling, and it's dangerous, not just for the animals, but for us. And like looking at that big picture, I think I hope people, take heed and do the right thing, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man. No, I didn't want to bring us back down, but I have to ask you about bird flu before I let you go into the world. Um, I
Yeah.
want
You're right. But let's just remind everyone that there's reasons to be hopeful, right?
there
Like
is hope.
there is hope. Humanity has gone through major challenges before, and we don't live in feudal systems anymore. Many of us live in democracies, thankfully. We have, people overcame Nazi Germany, right? Like there's reasons to be hopeful, and I know that there is a better world ahead of us.
Yeah, we just got to stay active.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, where can folks Oh, hold on one second. Sorry, I'm getting my list of patrons that I'm going to thank in a minute. But where can folks find you? Or do you want them to find you? I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. No, people. I guess I'm on the internet, and so always reach out. I have the great honor of leading the preventing pandemics at the Source Coalition. I have, I'm around, so reach out if any of this is of interest. You want to dive deeper.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you very much, Neil Vora, MD. You got to say it like that. You are an inspiration to me, and again, you remind me that everything is connected, right? All aspects of climate, human health, and just nature. We're all intertwined, and if one of us suffers, then we all suffer. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for all the work that you're doing. You're an inspiration as well. I You're fantastic at communicating, so thank you.
Thank you. I get it from you. I'm learning from you.
Goes both ways.
Uh, well, and here's a quick reminder to folks at home. Please like, subscribe, and comment if you have anything to say. And if you want to support the production of this little show, please find me on Patreon and join. And I want to thank my amazing producer, Peter DeTucker. You are a gem and make this all happen. So, and next week, I have two very exciting and fierce guests, Dr. Kara Achenbach and Dr. Sarah Lacey. They are the authors of Woman the Hunter, the physiological evidence and the archaeological evidence. And they've gotten a lot of blowback and pushback for their results. But let's just say, yeah, the proof is in the pudding, and they've got a bunch of pudding. So until then, thank you so much. And this is Survival of the Filthiest. Mwah. I don't know why I kissed and said goodbye to you. Oh, my patrons. Oh, thank you. We're still a work in progress. Okay, patrons, listen up. Thank you very much. Daniel Wynn, Claude Allen, Tom Skullbeard, Tori Yates Orr. Hold on, I'm losing them. Hold on one second. I love when this happens. Redding Maley. Love you, Redding. Dana Logan, Michael Z. Weinstock. Hey, bud. David Leitner, James Hudspeth. Woo. Anthony Zana, Tom Berman. Hello, Tom. Jen Beverstock. Scott Froschauer, JSB, Jeff Cohen, Andrea Bloom, and Jonathan Marks. Thank you. Keep coming back.